Command here. What are some of the ideas that your groups were able to come up with that are great ways to pass along patriotism to the succeeding generations? Any volunteers? What do you have? Yes.
Can I share what you said about Daniel? Yeah. Her grandson was involved
Speak
in
up,
boys.
please.
We can't hear you.
There you go.
Kay's grandson was involved with, well, Brenda's son. No, it's really about Kay's grandson. But he was in the Boy Scouts, and the Boy Scouts served at the Veterans Celebration in the parade, and then here presenting colors. And she shared that, now he is, what's his rank?
He's a first lieutenant in Germany right now.
First lieutenant in Germany right now. So, it's just involving younger kids, getting them involved in civic activities at a younger age, and then including them in things like the veteran program.
I like it. Civic activities. Involve them in civic activities and in the Veterans Program. Fantastic. Good. Anything else? What else do you have? How do we pass on patriotism to our kids? Given that the country's, I lived through, I was really, really young. I was too young to really know what was going on, but the whole Vietnam thing. And then was kind of big enough by the early 70s to be aware that people were mistreating returning veterans and stuff like that. And so I think that has had a very negative impact on our culture. I think it's hard also sometimes for Christians who are supposed to turn the other cheek to kind of, resolve that with, or kind of connect that with supporting the fact that we have to take up arms and defend people who can't defend themselves. So, ideas for passing on patriotism to the next generations. What do you have?
What about you guys? You guys used to do the honor flight stuff. You guys used to do like welcoming back or see a mom or something like that?
What's that? What's honor flag?
When are you guys explain it?
Veterans flag in Washington.
Everybody listen to each other. No, you do it.
Hey, explain what it was.
I don't remember it. It was in like second grade. What?
The honor flights is like the
Honor flags was going to honor flight, okay, was going to Washington, D.C. to look at it. Did you know that the moment? Okay, that was a different thing. They would get bused to the airport and see folks. Something that was mentioned here Saturday is that we have over 500 names on our memorial. In a town of 2,100 people, we got 500 names on. Wow, that's pretty epic. I mean, it blew me away. Poppy flowers, and that does what? What is that?
It's a tradition.
Tradition?
I guess. They're always there.
They're always there.
On Memorial Day. Well, on Memorial Day.
Is that World War I, World War II? World War I. Okay, what else do you have? Yes?
We wrote letters to the veterans this week.
Wrote letters to the veterans this week.
Oh, cool.
Fantastic. Preschool kids sent letters. Very nice. Okay, good. Yes?
Well, the parade I know was very short, but normally it's much longer than that. But in the past, way back when people remember like Hank Brandis and Dean Brandis and Jack Hutcherson, anytime I live out of town, but being at the post office, those people would push poppy, little artificial one.
Right.
And also, it used to, they would sell tickets, $10 to come to in the old days. But it was well attended, and this would be just totally, jam-packed full of it.
Jam-packed full of people. Yeah. Good. All right. Yes?
I think the reason, I think there's a communication issue. Like we used to, at the elementary school, print out a little thing that said, this is when it is, decorate your bikes, bring wagons, da-da-da-da-da. And I don't know if Randy Brandon could address that. I don't know if that happens anymore.
No, I actually
So-
don't even know if the Veterans Day parade was
So,
very cool.
Is that,
That's fantastic, yeah. It was also in this ancient thing called a newspaper. Right after we used to chisel into stones, we came up with this other thing. Yeah, it was in the newspaper along with a big, it was about 3/4 of a page, it seems like, or maybe a full page, that there would be a parade and there was some stuff in there about it and stuff. You kids Google that newspaper, then Google that.
You should put it in the church bulletin.
Church bulletin would be great.
bulletin?
This is just saying you should put it in there,
Oh,
so
yeah, you did.
everybody knows about it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it should be under, like, on the calendar, it should have said it was happening.
Yeah.
If they rent it, they get it for free.
Yeah, I mainly read the newspaper because I'm interested in history, and that is a historic artifact. So but I had no idea about the American Legion thing, which was here
It's been here.
in our place, and it's been here a long time.
But
Yeah.
also, the high school always has something where the veterans come.
Yeah, there was Friday, the day before, there was a 2 o'clock thing over at the school for the, yes. Very good. Okay, great conversation. Let's keep that ball rolling because it's a big deal. And let's break into our age-appropriate groups. We're going to dig in tonight we're going to move toward the modern era and radical change in the Middle East. What has been the impact? What has been the impact on the Jewish people, Anno Domini, after, in the year of our Lord, after Christ? In 132 in the Bar Kokhba revolt, remember that the Jews were slaughtered. Following that, Hadrian slaughtered 580,000 of the Jews. Judea was left as a wasteland. The population center shifted to Galilee. But something else that happened is that Jews were actually banished from Jerusalem. They were no longer allowed to enter their own holy city except for one day a year, which was Tisha B'Av. And that in Hebrew means the ninth day of Av, which is just a month of the year in their calendar. On our calendar, that lands in August. This year, that day was sunset on August 12 until sunset on August 13. Tisha B'Av is the day of tragedy or the day of disaster by nickname. It's just the 9th of Av. But it's a day of tragedy. It was the day when the only day the Romans would allow a Jew into Jerusalem so they could go to the Wailing Wall and remember that their temple had been destroyed twice. Once by Babylon, the second time by Rome. And that tradition of going to the Wailing Wall continues today. So that was August 12th, because their day starts at evening and goes to the next evening, not midnight to midnight. So it's August 12th, sundown to sundown, August 13th. In 326, newly Christianized Rome destroyed the pagan temples. In 380, Theodosius I declares Nicene Christianity to be the state religion of the Roman or Byzantine Empire. This always goes badly for the church wherever this happens, and it did. Theodosius, after announcing that the Byzantine Empire was officially Christian, continued to refuse to let Jews enter their own capital city, except for that one day a year so they could come and remember that Rome took them down. In 610, so we talked about Muhammad, was born in 570, began having visions right about 610. Muslims start coming to pray at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They're allowed in, Jews are not. So now you're going to start seeing down into modern times a bubbling resentment that goes back centuries. So under the Christian emperor, Muslims can come and pray on the ruins of the temple, but Jews can't. In return, a Jewish revolt against Heraclius, who was the emperor at that time, begins in Antioch and moves in the direction of Jerusalem. And by 614, the Jewish revolt joined with the Sassanids in open war against the Byzantine Empire, which the Sassanids won. So in 614, the Holy Land, and therefore Gaza, falls to the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid Empire is the last Iranian non-Muslim empire. So it goes Persian Empire, Parthian in terms of being out of Iran. Persian Empire, Parthian Empire, Sassanid. And the Sassanid Empire actually was the second longest, over 400 years. It dominated the Middle East. And it was officially Zoroastrian, for those keeping score at home. 620, so about 6 years after this, is Muhammad's night journey. And we're going to talk about that, because this will now change the landscape of the Temple Mount. Muhammad's night journey has two component parts, and they both, here, let's just put night journey. Both of these things are supposed to have happened on the same night in 620. The first is called Isra. I-S-R-A. The Isra is when Muhammad took flight on a burak, B-U-R-A-Q, which is essentially sort of a Pegasus, winged horse thing, flew on this burak to Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, the noble sanctuary, where he, according to Islam, where he led Abraham, Moses, and Jesus in prayer. That happened on the Temple Mount. The other thing that happened the same night is the Mirage. The Mirage, which means ascension, on that same night, Muhammad ascended to heaven in order to greet the prophets of the Old Testament and to ask God to reduce his demand for daily prayer from 50 times a day to 5 times a day. And God thought he was such a great guy, he did it. He reduced it to 5 times a day. So now they only had to turn and pray 5 times a day. Al-Aqsa means farthest mosque. It is the third now holiest location in Islam. So Mecca is number 1, where Muhammad is born. It's in Saudi Arabia, where he's born, number 1. Number 2 is Medina, where his tomb is there. It's number 2 holiest site. And the Temple Mount, the single holiest place in all of Judaism, becomes the third holiest place in Islam. That'll go well. In 622, Muhammad has a mosque built at Medina. In 629, the Byzantine Empire retakes the Holy Land, but only for 7 years. 632, Muhammad dies. We talked about Sunni and Shiite Islam. The Sunni faction, which is 90% today of Islam, believes the actual successor to Muhammad was his father-in-law. Shia Islam, about 10% of Islam today, but all of Iran, believes that his son-in-law is the rightful heir. That split caused a lot of fighting and a lot of war. 636, so just 4 years after Muhammad dies, 636, the Rashidun Caliphate takes control of the Holy Land. This is a Sunni faction, and we're going to run through some of these because they're constantly at war. Remember the prophecy of Ishmael. He will be a wild donkey of a man with his hand against everyone. They'll be constantly at war. What's significant about the Rashidun Caliphate is that they were very tolerant of other religions. They didn't bother Christians. They didn't bother the Jews. And they ended the prohibition on the Jews coming to their own holy city. So they got along very well with everybody. It's during the time of the Rashidun Caliphate that the Dome of the Rock is built, and that's the picture. That's what you see in the pictures of Jerusalem. You see that domed building sitting on the Temple Mount. You'll see the Dome of the Rock. Now, Al-Aqsa is the mosque and the compound. The Dome of the Rock is not the mosque. The Dome of the Rock is something else. This is what the Dome of the Rock is. The Dome of the Rock covers what's called the foundation stone, a slab that is understood to be the point at which God created the universe. He made the universe literally from that spot and took dirt from that and formed Adam at that spot. Also at that spot is supposed to be the sacrifice of Isaac and a number of other things. For some Jews, their concern is, well, obviously there's now this, a mosque and this sitting on the ruins of the Second Temple. That's a problem. In addition, many of them believe that the foundation stone is actually the rock where the Ark of the Covenant sat in the Holy of Holies. And that there is a hole in that rock that goes down into a chamber called the Well of Souls, where the Ark of the Covenant may still be hidden. But nobody can touch it because of religious sensibilities. And there's the Dome of the Rock sitting on it. The Dome of the Rock is built as an 8-sided Byzantine structure. This is very, very, very early in Islam. And this building is different than the Kaaba, for example, which is a 4-sided cubic or rectangular building normally used, for example, in Medina and Mecca. This is different, and it follows Byzantine architecture. And there's a whole history behind this thing, but we're going to move ahead. So that's 691, the Dome of the Rock is built. The next folks to come to town are the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Tulanid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate comes back 150 years after they had a first go around. We're kind of running through these because it just keeps flipping hands, but they're all caliphates. These are all Islamic groups. Of interest to us is in 969, the Fatimid Caliphate. That's interesting because they're the first Shia caliphate to take over the Middle East and develop an empire. Fatima was Muhammad's wife, so we have kind of a descendancy thing going on, honor for her, and the group believing that the son-in-law, not the father-in-law, was the rightful heir of Islam. There's the Atsiz ibn Uwaq Caliphate for 4 years. 1077 is Seljuk Turk. They are very interesting because the Seljuk Turk Caliphate is also Persian. So after the Muslim conquest under the Abbasids of Iran, Iran becomes officially Muslim. That's how Islam was spread throughout the Middle East at the point of a sword. And the Seljuk Turks. This is the rise of Turkish nationalism that will end up leading eventually to the Ottoman Empire. 1070, the Fatimid Caliphate takes over again. 1079, the Seljuk Turks take it back for 20 years. 1099, the Crusaders come to town. Not the basketball team. But and when they come to town, the point of being there is to retake the Holy Land from Muslims. They formed the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which will last for 103 years. They convert the Dome of the Rock into a church. That's going to go well. For a brief time, about 5 years or so, a Muslim group takes back Jerusalem, but not the rest of the Holy Land, and then the Crusaders take back Jerusalem itself. And then in 1260, is the Mamluk Caliphate. This is interesting because not only does it kind of kick the Crusaders out, but Mamluk is a word that means slave. So the Muslims, you could convert at the point of the sword, or in some cases you could become a slave. And there were some in-between folks who were non-Arab but Muslim, who could never attain full status under Islam because they weren't Arabic, according to various folks and authorities. So you could still be a slave, but you could bear arms, which no other slave could do because they weren't Muslim. So there's fully Arab Muslim. There's non-Arab Muslim slave that can bear arms and be soldiers for the Arab Muslims, and then there's just slaves. Since the 8th century, the 700s, this is really important historically, Muslims began raiding Europe and other places, but Europe, to take European Christians as slaves. And there was an active slave trade in European Christians. And going all way. In fact, when the Portuguese began getting into the African slave market, it had existed for centuries. It had primarily actually been focused on raiding Italy, even as far as England, and taking Christian Europeans as slaves. And the Portuguese were, well, then we can do that. And they didn't justify it. But the point is that slavery wasn't only a thing where Africans were, it's all horrible, obviously. But slavery was a pretty common thing in the ancient world. You lose a war, you become a slave. But the Muslims were, and in fact, Islamic slavery lasted into the 20th century in some places, and Mauritania just outlawed it in 1981. In 1260, the Mongols came to town, and they allied with the Crusaders. They reached the walls of Jerusalem, but could not take it. In the 1200s, the Ottoman Empire was founded in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and began rising in power. In 1453, Ottoman forces brought down the Byzantine Empire that had existed since Imperial Rome got its start in 27 BC. The end of the Byzantine Empire brought fear to Europe that the Muslim Ottomans would actually come to town and start taking, which they did eventually start doing. But the Ottomans captured the Holy Land in 1516. And they will hold it until 1918. They will have it for a massive chunk of history. So let's talk about now in terms of who held the land the longest. The Romans held it for 683 years. The Judahites, or Jews, including the modern nation state of Israel, for 471 years. And the Ottoman Empire, 401 years. There's your top three. Now, as we're going through, first of all, any questions? One of the key things, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, that I want to mention here before we move forward, because now we're going to get into, that was the point, get into the modern era, is that all of these caliphates that are in and out are mainly fighting each other and not really being terrible to the Christians and the Jews. So the population of Jewish people in the Holy Land is really stable from the slaughter committed by Hadrian all the way through until the time of the Ottoman Empire. There's still somewhere in the ballpark of 400,000 Jewish people living in the Holy Land. It's stable all the way through. All of that changes under the Ottoman Empire. The early years of empire are great. Ottomans are fantastic to the Christians and the Jews. And then as we get into, they push into Europe and they start fighting. By the time of Martin Luther, look at this date, a year before the 95 Theses, right? The year before is when the Ottoman Empire takes the Holy Land. During the lifetime of Luther, the Ottomans have laid siege to Vienna, Austria, and they're threatening to take the city, and it's not really certain that they won't. And if Vienna falls, Europe falls. And it was that close to Europe being forced converted to Islam. Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. And you can see that in the writings of Martin Luther. You can see it in our confessional documents, various references to the Muslim Turks and the threat that they posed. One of the reasons why Luther could get away with, if you will, as much as he did, was because Charles V was occupied with trying to push back the Turks invading into Europe, so he couldn't just call out his forces and kill Martin Luther. He couldn't risk losing the support of the German princes at a time when he needed every single man he could get to be into this battle, which was essentially a battle to save Western civilization. Timing is everything. Yeah. All right, to review. Genesis 13:15, God promises Abraham that the land will be his and his descendants' land forever. Genesis 17, verse 8, God says this is an everlasting covenant that he's making with Abraham, that the land of Canaan will be Abraham and his descendants' land forever. In Deuteronomy 20, there's a command to take that land from the Canaanite tribes that are living in that land, but in Leviticus 26:14 to 46, God modifies the covenant to say, if you follow me and you obey my commands, and if you are my people, the way I want you to be my people, you'll live in the land long and you will prosper. If you do not keep my commands, I will take away the land and give it to somebody else. In the New Testament era timeline, Rome, at the time of Rome, so BC, Rome comes to town 62 BC, there are about 1.5 million Jews according to historical records, living in the land at that time. Hadrian, following the Bar Kokhba revolt, kills 580,000 of them. Down to the time of the Ottoman Empire, it stabilized, as I mentioned, about 400,000. But under the Ottoman Empire, after the siege of Vienna fails, and after the Holy Roman Empire starts winning, they took back the Balkans, pushing. By the 1800s, the Turks have stopped being nice to anybody. They're cracking down right and left. Everybody is a suspected enemy. And Jews begin fleeing persecution in droves, leaving the Holy Land, primarily headed for places like Russia, Eastern Europe, even Western Europe. By 1800, contemporary historical sources say there are maybe 1,000 families left in the Holy Land that are Jewish. In 1869, Mark Twain visited Ottoman-controlled Holy Land, and he wrote back how disheartening it was to stand in Judea and look around as far as you could see in every direction to the horizon, and the Holy Land is a wasteland. There's nobody, there's nothing there. It's a lonely, lonely place. In 1881, Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster Abbey, visited Ottoman-controlled Holy Land and likewise called it a wasteland. Nobody is there. The point being made here, and Benjamin Netanyahu brings this up in his autobiography, the claim that the Arabs were controlling the land and holding the land and farming the land is a bogus claim because we have historical sources saying it's an absolute wasteland and nobody's there. That's the point. And also his point will be that the Ottoman Empire ran off the Jews that had been there since God gave them the land in the time of Moses and Joshua, and that they would still have been there constantly through had it not been for the Ottoman Empire and Muslim invaders. That's behind the historical argument that's going on even today. In terms of culture, remember that the Babylonians had captured the Israelites and kept them in captivity for 70 years. When Cyrus of Persia let them go home, the Persians were very tolerant of the Jews, paid for the rebuilding of the temple, and so forth. The Greeks under Alexander the Great were intolerant. They forced Greek culture and language. Rome likewise was intolerant. The Crusaders were tolerant-ish, depending on who was the boss at the time. The early caliphates were all tolerant. As we approach the time of the Ottoman Empire, things get a little tougher for Jews, and in the later Ottoman Empire, it's completely intolerant, and not only against Jews. Remember, it's the Ottoman Empire that also engages in genocide against Armenian, Greek, Turkish, and other Christians. The Kingdom of Armenia, by the way, was the first Christian kingdom historically, and tens of thousands of Christians were systematically hunted down in the later years of the Ottoman Empire and killed. We'll move forward from there in just a minute. Okay, any questions so far?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is the Dome of the Rock, is it a mosque? Is it just a shrine?
It's a shrine. That's right. Yeah, it's a shrine. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Now, because it was turned into a church for a while by the Crusaders, when they took it over and they redecorated, there are some blasphemous things written in Arabic around the inside with regard to Jesus not being God and so forth and stuff. But, and you can't go in there, but the gentleman that I mentored in the SMP program, Specific Ministry Pastor program, was able to go over there as part of his coursework, and was able to look through one of the screens over the windows, and they'll let you do that. You can look in, you just can't go in and he's got a picture of some of, and then got that translated, what the stuff was saying there.
How many European countries were involved in the Crusades?
It was primarily France and England, but primarily France. That's a great question. By the way, in the time of the Crusades, in that, give or take 1099 to 1260 period, tons and tons of French Christians moved to the Holy Land. So much so, and other Europeans as well, but primarily French. So much so that French became the second kind of national language. Latin was the primary, but French became the secondary language. And Christians, by 1260, Christians outnumbered Jews in the Holy Land. So many of them moved there, yeah. Now that all changes, when the caliphs come to town, then the Christians flee.
So, Pastor,
Yes.
you mentioned the Ottomans, getting to Venice, but I recall my niece went to school one summer in Granada, Spain,
Yeah.
and there was a cathedral that was built
Yep.
on the ruins of a mosque.
Yep.
And so they got through.
The
quite a bit.
caliphs
Yeah.
did take Spain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is.
They kicked him out in 1492.
Right. Yeah. Moorish Spain. All right, this brings us to the modern era. 1881, the same year that the Dean of Westminster Abbey visited the Holy Land, controlled by the Ottoman Empire, an event took place called the First Aliyah. Implying that there will be more. The first Aliyah means going up. Okay. 35,000 Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe emigrate back to the Holy Land. This takes place in 1881 and 1882. And the Rothschild family sets up a banking system to help finance Jews going home. And what's going to happen as they begin returning back home, by 1881 is, the Ottoman Empire is weakening, and we'll do more on that in just a second. But the point is that as they come back home, they're very, very different than the average immigrant. They've come to another country and so forth. They come home with the expectation that that's still my land. So they've left under the Ottomans, they've gone somewhere else, and they've maybe lived somewhere else for 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, generations, and come home, that's my land. And nobody's on it, so they build their hut or whatever and start farming that land. That's our land, that's our family land. It's very different than us. If I go visit Italy and go back to, Monte Creto in Modena province, I'm not going to walk into town and find great-grandpa's property and say that's my land. It would never occur to me. But I don't have scripture saying God gave it to me either. Now, humans are humans, so they're going to tend to remember what best supports their case. So they're going to sort of forget about the Leviticus thing. If you don't obey me, you lose the land. Must not be in my Bible. So they're coming home, that's my land. 35,000 is a big jump when there's maybe 3,000, 4,000 up to, and 35,000 show up. That's going to get your attention. In 1896, Theodore, I'll get his last name right, Herzl, Theodore Herzl writes a book called The Jewish State. He's a brilliant philosopher, and Herzl posits that until the Jewish people have their own nation, have their own state, Until they have that, they will never be safe. Everywhere they go, they work super hard. They invest. They become part of the culture. They become successful and then get persecuted for being successful. And it doesn't matter whether it's Russia, France, it doesn't matter. They do well eventually. They're dirt poor to start with, but they're scrappy and they're smart and they do well, then they get persecuted. Herzl advocates the establishment of a Jewish state in 1896, and this catches the imagination of every Jewish person. The next year, 1897, they hold the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Now, as a result of the book and the first Zionist conference, they decide that for the safety of the Jewish people, this new Jewish state they're going to establish has got to be secular. It can't be based on Jewish religion, or they'll invite automatic persecution on the basis of the religion. They will continue to be religious people, but the state itself will be secular. Now, Reform rabbis and Orthodox rabbis, those are branches of Judaism, both spoke out against Zionism on the basis of it being primarily secular. Especially the Orthodox. And you've heard today, right, there are issues going on with the Orthodox. If you try to conscript them and force them into this battle, you have a problem inside of Israel. You have, they will come out in the streets and you are going to definitely hear about it. Their issue is the exile, what they're calling the new exile, the fleeing of the Ottoman Empire and settling all over Europe, was divine punishment for not being faithful to Yahweh. Therefore, we must wait for God to send a Messiah and restore the nation of Israel as a theocracy under a king like David. Herzl responded that rabbis should stay in synagogues and leave the Zionists alone. That went well. He said, the idea of a state is separate and different from the idea of religion. Zionism is a desire to be free from religion and form a new Israel made of secular nationalism that will give us the freedom to practice our religion. Very interesting stuff. As we get closer to 1900, and as the Ottoman Empire weakens and weakens and weakens, and even starts to have internal conflicts, it kind of looks around and sees kind of a rising Germany and the Central Powers, and war is on the horizon. World War I is on the horizon, and they start kind of calculating which side do we join, which one is going to be the most successful. Meanwhile, in 1905, so in 1897, we have the first Zionist Congress. 1905, we have the second Zionist Congress. At that Zionist Congress, there were three possibilities set forward for the establishment of a Jewish nation where they could be free. One was Argentina, buying land in Argentina, and then working out how to make that a Jewish nation inside of Argentina. Uganda was considered, and of course Palestine. Palestine was chosen because it's the historic homeland of the Jews. From 1904 to 1914, so right before this, until 1914 was the second Aliyah. In the second Aliyah, another 40,000 Jews, almost all of them fleeing Russian pogroms, flooded into the Holy Land. And at this time, they started the kibbutz movement. Remember the October 7th thing last year was against the kibbutzes? This is where they discover they're going back to farmland that hasn't been worked in generations, and it's really, really hard. It's rocky. And so they form these kibbutzes, which are communes, where the families sort of hold all of the land together, and they work together and they help each other to farm this really difficult land. They also form a paramilitary called Hashomer, which in Hebrew means watchman. And in 1902, they found the Anglo-Palestinian Bank, the first bank in the Holy Land. Again, how they say to help each other out. The Ottoman Empire chooses, in 1911, to side with the Central Powers. By 1915, things aren't looking so good. The Allies are starting to have the upper hand. So to not fight a protracted war, the British offer the Balfour Declaration to the Jews. And they promised Jews all over the world, if you will help the Allies, if you'll come fight on the side of the Allies, you will have a Jewish homeland. The Balfour Declaration is published in England. It's in print, it's put in writing, it's a written promise. You'll have a homeland. About the same time, British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, promises Sharif Hussein of Mecca that if Arabs will help the Allies fight, they will have an independent state after the war, if they will rise up against the Ottoman Empire, and they do under a guy named T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. They join the Allies. McMahon did not name Palestine as the location of an Arab state. Neither did the Balfour Declaration. Just, if you will fight, Jews, if you will fight on the side of the Allies, you get a homeland. Arabs, if you will fight, different guy. If you will fight on the side of the Allies, you will get a homeland. Nobody's promising Palestine specifically. In 1916, France and Britain reached the Sykes-Picot Agreement, just named after the guys who mediated it, that after the war, they're starting to figure they're going to win. After the war, today's Syria and Lebanon will be given to France, and today's Jordan and Iraq will be given to Britain, and Palestine will be shared under international control. In 1919, the same Lord Balfour, right after the close of the war, issues the Balfour Memorandum, the follow-up document saying, your homeland, Jews, will be in Palestine, and we don't propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants. So the war ends. In 1918, the armistice is signed, 11, 18, the 11th hour. And Britain and France, as part of the treaty ending the war, are given what they wanted under the Sykes-Picot Agreement that they had formally worked out. The Balfour Memorandum in 1919 promises the Jews, now you will have your own land in Palestine, but the Arabs have not been promised that by anybody. And so at the signing of the armistice, Sharif Hussein of Mecca sends his son Faisal to make sure the British keep their promise. We're going to get a homeland. As the negotiations go on, the League of Nations is formed. In 1920, the League of Nations gives control of Palestine to Britain, not to the Jews. They mandate, however, that Britain will carry out the Balfour Declaration and will prepare people in Palestine for eventual self-government, with the understanding that that will be where the Jewish nation is going to be, in this place called Palestine. And I have a map of that. So in 1923, the Independent Republic of Turkey is formed out of the remains, the crushed remains of the Ottoman Empire. That's the modern nation we know today of Turkey. You can see the French Mandate of Syria in green, the British Mandate of Palestine, the British Mandate of Mesopotamia. Those are the borders of Iraq today. Over here where it says independent, that's Iran today. Independent Saudi Arabia, etc. Notice the shape of the British Mandate of Palestine. It's very interesting. Because, I don't know if can you see right below the arrow, the Dead Sea? So to the right of that, that's Jordan. But there's no Jordan on that map. So in the midst of all these negotiations, Sharif Hussein is becoming more and more angry. He's starting to accuse the British of going back on their promises. And so here's what they work out. And this is passed by the League of Nations. The area called Transjordan will become the modern nation of Jordan. So remember, the British Mandate of Palestine, which includes that land, had been promised in writing to be the Jewish state, the new Jewish state. The Balfour Memorandum sealed it. The League of Nations said to enforce it, and boom, they go back. Right? And Jordan is created as an Arab state, an autonomous sultanate under Abdullah Hussein, which is Sharif's son. Iraq, the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, becomes the new kingdom of Iraq under Faisal Hussein, which is why the Saddam Hussein name sounds familiar. That's still that family line from Sharif Hussein. So the promises of McMahon to the Arabs, if you join the conflict against the Ottomans, you will have an independent Arab state. Those are kept, but not in Palestine, which is what they really want. To the British and the French, and frankly to the League of Nations, what's the big deal? You have your own place. And by the way, you'll hear a lot of times people say, it's Britain's fault, or it's Britain and France's fault that all these problems happen in the Middle East. They arbitrarily, drew up. They were not arbitrarily drawn up lines. Those are the same lines, the same boundaries that the Ottoman Empire had for centuries before the end of the war. All they did was simply say, now you're a country. But the lines were there. Those were already districts, those were always units that were governed under the Ottoman Empire. Those aren't brand new made-up things.
So what type of government did the Ottomans have then?
It was a caliphate. So it was, the top guy rules it all. And he enforces the law, and it all goes downhill through emirs and all of that. Yeah. Nothing in Palestine for the Arabs. Angry crowds of Arabs start protesting in Jerusalem right away. Both Jews and Arabs at the same time believed that they had been promised the same land. Everybody wants Palestine. Zionists continued to move in, and riots broke out in Jerusalem. Arabs form a paramilitary and attack Jewish settlers. In 1921, Britain has to crack down and restore order. In 1919 to 1923 is the third Aliyah. And the third Aliyah brings another 40,000 Jews into the Holy Land. 45% were Russia, 31% were from Poland, and the remaining from Eastern Europe, all of them fleeing persecution. 1924 to 1928 is the fourth Aliyah. $80,000 Jews come to the Holy Land from Europe. And look how fast this is happening. You go from about 3,000 or 4,000 Jews prior to the first Aliyah, and then it's like 20 and 25 and 40. Now it's 80. 80,000 Jews from Europe. 1929 to 1939 is the fifth Aliyah. $250,000 Jews come to the Holy Land, escaping growing Nazi sentiment. By the 1920s, and remember, by the way, if they find the land abandoned, they set up camp. They form a Jewish settlement. This was our historic family land. Nobody's here. Nobody's farming. It's our land. If the land is owned, even as far back as the very late Ottoman Empire, returning Jews would buy the land legally from Arab owners. If it was available for sale, they would work out a deal. They'd offer enough money to make it for sale, and they would buy the land, and it would be registered under the Ottoman Empire. And this practice continues until the 1920s, when the local Arab authorities, even though they're under the British mandate, local Arab authorities are like, no, we're not selling any more land to Jews. We're not doing that. And they shut that down. But they keep coming in these incredibly massive numbers. 741. In 1933, Nazi persecution begins in Germany. And all of a sudden now there's a huge impetus to have massive numbers of Jews flee Europe and come to the Holy Land. It begins in Germany and Austria. In 1935, David Ben, let me get his name right. David Ben Golin is elected chairman of the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency is formed to get people out of Germany and Austria, get Jewish people out of Germany and Austria and get them into the Holy Land in a really coordinated way. And he also, at the same time, becomes commander of the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary that's actually been forbidden by the British. In 1936, in response, Arab leaders call a general strike, calling for an end to Jewish immigration and an end of selling land to Jews permanently. It becomes an uprising, and more than 300 Jews and several hundred Arabs are killed in the resulting conflict. In 1936, the Arab High Committee is formed, and it's chaired by Amin al-Husseini, who's the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. That was a position that the Ottomans created, kind of to give down fatwas or religious pronouncements on the basis of the empire. And the Arab, let me get his name right. The High Committee wants Amin al-Husseini solve this issue. He goes to Germany and tries to meet with Hitler to find out how to really persecute the Jews. Hitler can't be bothered with him, but Eichmann can. And Eichmann actually befriends him. Eichmann travels to Palestine, learns Hebrew, language and culture, to use it as a weapon against the Jews in Germany. Word gets out, and this pretty much cements Jewish distrust of Arabs from then on. Britain is being pulled back and forth between the Arabs and the Jews. One group fights the other group fights the other group. In 1939, the British called a St. James Conference with Jewish and Arab representatives. World War II is looming. Britain is becoming extremely nervous that Arabs may join the Axis powers against them in order to have leverage in the Holy Land. The Arabs refuse to sit down at the table. Also in 1939, the British issue a white paper saying to the Arabs they actually have no intention of creating a uniquely Jewish state in Palestine. That word gets out. So now the Jewish people start distrusting the British. In 1939, there's a mass exodus out of Europe of Jews headed for the Holy Land. Hundreds of thousands of Jews have left, and they're trying to flee to Palestine. And now, for the first time, Britain tries to block ships from arriving in the Holy Land and even starts deporting Jews back to Germany. World War II plays itself out. 1945, the end of World War II, British policy doesn't change. Refugee camps obviously are forming. People are being sneaked into Palestine. The British begin capturing and sending Jews who are coming into the country, sending them to Cyprus to be kept in detention camps in pretty deplorable conditions. 1946, British soldiers raid Jewish settlements and discover documents that find that the Jewish Agency was actually helping illegal immigration. They arrest 2,700 people. In retaliation, Jewish militants bomb the King David Hotel. It's 1946. The bombing of the hotel kills 91 soldiers and turns the tide of British sentiment against staying in the Holy Land. In 1947, the UN forms an inquiry committee which proposes a two-state solution in Palestine. 53% of the land will go to the Jews. 46% will go to the Arabs, and Jerusalem will remain, that 1% will remain internationally controlled by the UN as a no man's land. Everybody can be there, everybody can use it, no one group has special access. The Jews in the Holy Land accept this solution, and the Arabs reject it on the basis that it provides for any territory for the Jews at all on the other side of the river. World opinion at the end of World War II has completely shifted to where popular sentiment now is that the only reparation for Nazi barbarism would be the creation of a Jewish state. So now world opinion has shifted and they want to have a Jewish state. In 1947, Haganah chartered an old ship and named it Exodus 1947 to bring displaced persons from refugee camps in Europe to Palestine. British Navy intercepted it, boarded the vessel by force, and in the ensuing tussle, 3 people were killed and 100 were wounded. The British sent the ship to France, which refused to let it dock, and then they rode alongside of it and forced it to Hamburg, causing international outrage. President Truman negotiated loans with the Philippines and Haiti to gather extra yes votes for a UN partition plan, the same plan that had already been rejected by the Arabs. It was passed by the United Nations in November of 1947, and again, it was accepted by the Jews, it was rejected by the Arabs. Out of board space. By early 1948, Britain announces the end of the mandate. They've had it. They're not going to fight back and forth with the Arabs and the Jews anymore. By the way, as a part of what they've been doing militarily in Palestine, they began using Arabs as human shields in their operations against Arab militants. That's where the Arabs learned that, from the British. They called for the end of the Jewish mandate. They're going to pull their troops out. They announced that they were going to be gone. On May 14 of 1948, even before the mandate had ended, David Ben-Gurion announces the new modern nation state of Israel with its capital at Tel Aviv. The capital could not be at Jerusalem at that time. It was currently occupied in the midst of riots, occupied by Arabs in the midst of riots. He called Shimon Peres, who at that time was in charge of weapon purchases for Haganah, and he said, "Today the people are dancing, but tomorrow blood will flow." We'll pause there, and we'll start with the next morning, May 15th, next week. Okay. Any questions? So next week we'll begin with the first Arab-Israeli War, 1948. We'll come forward through the Suez conflict. We'll begin with the wars of attrition, the Yom Kippur War, 1973, and the various accords, including the Camp David Accords. And the goal will be, we're going to make it all the way through October 7, 2023, and the conflict that's today, next week. So yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. I kind of barreled through some of this because we needed to make time, because we're going to take a break for Advent, and come back with another topic, and so yeah, I'm trying to kind of get us there. All right, thank you so much. Let's close with prayer. Almighty God, as we study this very tangled conflict, intractable conflict, where two groups of people are absolutely convinced the same patch of land is definitely theirs and nobody else's. We have to consider our own stubbornness and our own fleshly desires and impulses and how they affect our lives. So grant us reprieve from that. Forgive us for the times when we wanted to use, the power of our personality, verbal force or whatever to get our way, and cause us to be a people that live by invitation and not by force. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you guys so much for coming next week from 1948 to now.